This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
You think you know a story, but you only know how it ends. To get to the heart of the story, you have to go back to the beginning.
Did you ever see the series The Tudors? It was a miniseries that launched on Showtime in April 2007, and it basically covered the backstory, if you will, of King Henry VIII and the breakdown of his marriage with Catherine of Aragon, and of course his courting and eventual marriage to her Lady of Waiting, Anne Boleyn. It was an enormously popular show. It rapidly became one of the network's most popular shows. And it's really not hard to understand why. Right, if you just think about the intro, right, it starts with, you think you know a story. And it kind of assumes that all of us do know the story of Henry VIII, right, the legendary English king who launches the Reformation basically because he can't get a divorce from his 40-year-old wife. Henry desperately wants a son. Henry is emerging from a period of civil war in England. His father had done a lot to kind of consolidate the English monarchy and try to bring those wars to an end. And so Henry needed a son in order to guarantee succession, to have an undisputed succession. And of course, the tragic story, right? You have Anne, the lady in waiting. Eventually, he pushes Catherine to the side, marries Anne. He thinks that, okay, now everything is going to be fine. And of course, as most of you know, right, it doesn't work out. Anne never has a son that lives. She had at least one stillborn son. So then he gets tired of Anne and he goes to some other women, keeps trying to have children with them, keeps not having any males. Right? The kind of biological joke here is that sex basically comes from the male. You know, you get either X or your Y chromosome from your dad. So really, he was the one that was to blame for all this. But he tore through all these women. Several of them ended up being executed, including Anne, in 1536, only a couple years after she and Henry were finally married. Tragically, she's accused of adultery, she's accused of a number of other crimes, and she's beheaded. So the idea that The Tudors is going to make for captivating 21st century drama is not surprising, right? It tells the backstory, the rise and the fall of Anne Boleyn. It sort of identifies us, or we identify with the story of Catherine, right? The loving wife, the pious wife, the dutiful wife who's cast aside for the young upstart. Right? We have the story of a royal court with all of its wealth and its power. You know, what do people do at the royal court all day? Well, they sit around, they entertain themselves, or they're entertained. They eat a lot, they drink a lot, they play, they fight. Not a lot of hard work going on, at least not among the king and his immediate entourage. Of course, we also have lots of sex, lots of violence. For those of you that like sort of strategy, a lot of strategy going into it, right? Okay, who am I going to ally with this week to win the king's favor and make somebody else fall from grace? We'll even throw in a little bit of Christian theology to boot, right? These questions about religion, about the role of the papacy, the role of the church in the quest for salvation, these aren't just random questions, as we saw. This is a religious world, right? People not just believe in things, but they believe that that will materially impact their own daily lives. And so the question of whether or not the Pope is really God's representative on earth is a big deal. And for Henry, it was a big deal. Henry actually won the title Defender of the Faith because he published, in part, some works about the Reformation and responses to Martin Luther. So we have this tremendous interest in the Tudors, not just the Showtime miniseries, but in the general story of the Tudors. In fact, some of it predates, obviously, the Tudors miniseries from 2007. Some of it postdates it, right? As you'll see in this episode, I'm a bit of a cinephile. So I'll give you just a number of quick shows here. We've got Anne of the Thousand Days going back to 1969, Lady Jane Grey, 1986. There were 2 films about Elizabeth, who was Henry VIII's second daughter. The first called Elizabeth in 1998, and then its sequel, Elizabeth the Golden Age, that was about 10 years later, actually came out around the same time as The Tudors. In case you didn't have Showtime, you weren't getting your fix from that, you could also see stories about Anne Boleyn on the big screen. There was The Other Boleyn Girl with Scarlett Johansson and Natalie Portman. It's kind of funny, they got together in The Avengers later on. I just realized that. We had Mary, Queen of Scots, another film from 2018, kind of showing Mary's perspective. Starz had a show in 2019 called The Spanish Princess. So in case you didn't get enough of the backstory, if you wanted to see the kind of crazy story of how Henry VIII actually married his brother's widow, they were married for about 6 months, and then the brother died. There's some other shows, Wolf Hall. We've got another Elizabeth movie, Elizabeth I in 2005. So we love Tudor England, and we love the Tudors. We love Henry VIII. We love his daughters. We love the stories. In fact, we love them so much that this created all these other historical spin-offs, things like Borgias, the Medicis, Versailles, Reign, if you want to count that. Reign is very not historical, but I hear that a lot of teenagers like it. So clearly those of us living at the start of the 21st century are fascinated with the idea of early modern courts. But how well do these historical dramas reflect the realities of the time? What was it like to be a prince or a princess in the early modern period? If we had our time machine and we could go back in time, do we really want to hang out at the court of Henry VIII? Kind of a double-edged sword there, right? Depending on some ways that things could happen. What was Henry VIII really like? What is going through his head? What was going through most nobles' heads? What did it mean to be a king? What did kings want? What did they dream of? What did they aspire to? We asked these questions about peasants in our last episode, and we're also going to ask them today about kings and more distantly nobles. What did nobles think the job of government was? Right? You're in a position of power. What are you supposed to do with all that power? So these are some of the questions that we'll try to answer in today's episode as we explore the role of royalty in early modern society. So let's start with one of the big fundamental questions, which is specifically about the nature of rulership, right? What does it mean to be a king? Well, I think when we start thinking about medieval and to some extent early modern kings, we have these kind of 2 archetypes in our minds, right? The first is King Arthur. Take a minute, close your eyes, assuming you're not driving, of course. Think about King Arthur. What do you associate with King Arthur? If I said, hey, let's go see a movie. We're going to see this movie called First Night, 1995. It's about King Arthur. Who do you think is playing King Arthur? What kind of actor would you cast in that role? Or if you were going to remake that movie? Right? The 1995 movie, it went to Sean Connery. Right? And what kind of characters does Sean Connery usually play? He plays the good guy. He plays, maybe excepting James Bond, the honorable guy. He plays the virtuous character. Sean Connery's king is going to be a good king. He's going to be someone who's concerned with the welfare of his people. He's going to be a king that is going to try to sit above all of these petty concerns and who's sleeping with who and who's got more power. And Arthur, if you think about the legend, right? Arthur's not a real king, by the way. But if you think about the legend of Arthur, he's sitting around with his Knights of the Round Table. And what is he most concerned with? Justice. He wants to bring justice to the realm, to be a force for good, for God. So we love King Arthur, right? I found a website called ranker.com where if you're ever just sitting around and you have a lot of time on your hands, it's just lists of people ranked. So I found a ranking of the 38 top actors that have played King Arthur. So 38, right? And that's just in movies. There's a whole other side for miniseries and shows and things like that. So we love King Arthur because we look to the past. We use these stories. They give us an idea of values and virtues. I remember growing up, reading the Arthurian legends, thinking like, yeah, I could be a Knight of the Round Table. So we have that model of kingship out there. Of course, the other type of king out there is King John from the Robin Hood stories. Remember King John? His virtuous brother, Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, is off fighting in the Crusades, trying to win God's glory, and wicked John is back home, plotting, trying to increase his power, trying to increase taxes, trying to make all the little poor people suffer because he just doesn't care about them. All King John cares about is himself in his own personal glory. He's greedy. He's selfish. He's not afraid of violence. He's immoral. Sometimes we don't actually see King John. Sometimes they like to kind of pawn it off on the Sheriff of Nottingham, right? But we see all this dynamic, right? What's a good king? It's King Arthur. What's a bad king? It's John I. Now, both of these conceptions of kingship assume that kings held absolute power, right? The idea that the king walks in the room and you bow and awe and oh. The idea that the king can do whatever he wants, right? We would probably, in many cases, associate kingship with the idea of dictatorship. I find that a lot of my students tend to think that it's more or less the same thing, right? The king is the person in position of power. The king is the one who's making the rules, the laws, and everybody just kind of has to go along with it. There's no real recourse. Now, I get why people make those comparisons, but the reality is that it vastly overestimates the amount of power medieval and early modern kings and queens actually had. Someone like Henry VIII is not just sitting around like a spoiled brat saying, I want this, I want that, and everybody goes, yes, your majesty, and they all hop to it and they all do whatever he feels like. Quite the opposite. To be a king in many of these countries is to exist in a very difficult position where you are trying to navigate the politics of a variety of nobles that are kind of competing for your favor, but you are also limited by those same nobles, right? Technically, yes, you are the head of the national army, except there is no national army. You don't actually have a lot of troops that are loyal directly to you. Their loyalties are usually more towards nobles, right? There's indirect levels, indirect relationships that form this sort of nexus of power. So in fact, the early modern state is pretty small. Usually, it just consists initially of just the king's own household. And then over the course of time, they add a couple positions. Starting about the year 1000, 1100, somewhere in there, we start to see the growth of the modern state in Europe, right? The first beginnings of a growth of a modern state. We start to have people who are charged with various offices. They will have various responsibilities. But the machinery of state itself is actually pretty small. And so to finance this machinery of state, to the extent that it exists, the king basically uses his own money. The king has his own domains, his own lands. He has certain control over various industries potentially. And he collects money from that. Right? And then he maintains his state. Now, from time to time during the medieval period, that state will then require an army. And to raise the army, you need the nobles. Right? If you're looking earlier in the medieval period, this would be just sort of a call to arms. Right? All the nobility would get together and say, okay, the king wants to fight England. I'm the French king, let's go fight England. But it would require the consent of those nobles. As warfare becomes more complicated, as it becomes more diverse, as the role of the knight becomes increasingly less important, that relationship can become financial. So the king doesn't necessarily need all his nobles to saddle up and ride on over to Brittany or to Normandy to go fight the English. Instead, what he'd really like is just some money. So the financial side of things becomes pretty important. But kings don't have a bureaucracy to just collect taxes yet. And so what happens is when the nobles get together, the king says, I want to go fight this war. And the nobles say, okay, sure, we'll do that. But what's in it for us? The king says, well, perhaps I can offer you some sort of concession. To the extent that there are taxes, perhaps I can make it so that you and your descendants don't have to pay them. Perhaps I can guarantee you that I will not arrest you without a formal charge that then is submitted to a court. And so gradually over the course of time, the nobility began to acquire what we would call historical rights. And these historical rights then become limitations on what the king can or cannot do. Probably the best example of this type of deal is one of the most famous documents in British history, also very important for American political theory, the Magna Carta. Magna Carta is signed in 1215 between that wicked King John and his barons. Now, actually, King John was not that wicked. King John was someone who was interested in building up his own bureaucracy and trying to centralize his state a little bit. And so he fought some battles with his own barons because they didn't want to do that. And in the end, he has to sign this kind of humiliating treaty, the Magna Carta. And it says, the barons will have these rights in perpetuity. Now, ironically, the Magna Carta is actually thrown out, legally speaking, by the Pope relatively soon after it's passed. But it still becomes this kind of inspirational document, creates this idea of, okay, there are these historical rights out there that nobles can acquire and that the king has to respect. And so these rights then become incredibly problematic for exercising power. Now, we're talking here a lot about power, and it's worth thinking about this a little bit more deeply, right? We have lots of different ways that we theoretically express power in the modern world. There are various things that the state says you can and cannot do. And to some extent, it is able to police those things, right? It is able to stop you from doing them. Or at least if you're talking about something like murder, the idea that people are committing murders, you think, okay, well, someone murders someone else, there will be a consequence more often than not, right? The chances that you get away with it are very, very small, right? So the modern state can project power very easily. There's a disaster down in New Orleans, another one of these giant hurricanes hits, or in the Gulf Coast. We send in the army. We send in the National Guard. Right? The idea of projecting power is something that modern states are very good at. Medieval and early modern states struggle with this much more. And there's a great example that I want to give you that I think really sets up this discourse of power. It's a fictional example. It's from a show called Game of Thrones. Many of you probably were big fans of the show in the 2010 to 2018 period, when it was kind of at its height. And so there's this exchange at one point in one of the early seasons where you've got the queen, whose name is Cersei, and Cersei is kind of born into power. She's the definition of being someone that's aristocratic, someone that just walks around and kind of commands authority and almost has a sense of dread about her. And so she's talking to this guy named Littlefinger. And Littlefinger is a kind of pull yourself up by your own bootstraps type of guy. A guy who's always scheming, who's always plotting, who's one hell of a chess player, not too concerned about the rights and wrongs of things. Right? He starts making his money by opening a brothel. And then he gets into a little bit of intrigue. He starts lending money to people, which in the medieval period is also kind of a no-no. Then he makes it up into the council government, and he's kind of blurring the line between his personal finances and the finances of the city, right? So he's definitely an amoral guy, and the two of them are kind of a little sniping at each other. And Littlefinger says to her, prominent families often forget a simple truth. Knowledge is power. Of course, this is something you've probably heard before, right? Knowledge is power. Knowledge is power. You got to be the smartest one there. And Cersei responds with a demonstration of what real power is. She has these guards there, and she says, kill him. And they get their spears out, and they're ready to kill him, or their swords. And then she says, stop. Step back. Turn around. Look the other way. Put yourself in a position where this guy that you were just about to kill can now kill you. And she says, power is power. And it's such an important point for understanding the medieval and the early modern world, right? You can have all these theories. I mean, there is no pure theory of feudalism where somebody's kind of like mapped it out, and there's no Karl Marx of the 13th century. But you have these relationships, you have these expectations. As I said, these barons, they sign basically a contract or a charter with King John. They say, these are the rules you're supposed to follow. Right? So they do have an idea of law, an idea of expected and proper behavior. But in the early modern and the medieval world, the idea of enforcing those codes is much, much, much harder than what it is today. To say that the king is the supreme law of the land doesn't necessarily make it so. It depends on the king. It depends on what part of the country you're in. one of the big problems they have in medieval Europe that kind of spurs the growth of the modern state is that it is far easier for a rebellious noble or a Castilian. Castilian is basically the guy who you say, okay, I want you to hang out in this castle, defend this castle for me. It's so much easier for that noble or Castilian to say, I'm going to ignore what the king says, than it is for the king to put together an army to then go and take him out and say, okay, this is my will, you're going to follow it. It does happen from time to time. Someone like Charlemagne, French king, it's kind of before the French, the Frankish king in the 9th century, 8th and 9th century. He has a lot of authority by the end, right? He does have power. But many a medieval ruler, king, duke, bishop, runs into problems because you do not have this idea of being able to project power. You do not have this ability of being able to project power in the same way that we do today. There's a couple of ways that we can kind of understand this or see this playing out. One of the most basic ways is in terms of law, right? I just mentioned we have laws today. And not only do we think that most of those laws are enforced, right? I'm not going to go commit vandalism or murder or rape or stealing or things like that because there's a really good chance I'm going to get caught, right? Setting aside the moral questions. I'm not worried about if I go to Texas, then the law that was passed in Ohio might not apply, and I can just hang out in Texas. But we also live in a world in which law is not only kind of universally applied, but it's also rationalized. One of the reasons that we don't have a problem usually between laws in one state versus another is because when the United States was created, they said, okay, we're going to have a Supreme Court. And if Texas thinks it's one thing and Alabama thinks it's something else, then they can take it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will decide this is the way that it has to be. And Texas and Alabama or South Carolina or Oregon or California or whoever, they know they have to respect that decision. They don't just walk away and say, well, I know the Supreme Court said that we have to follow this law, but I don't like it. We're not going to follow it. This rationalized structure of law did not yet exist in early modern Europe. Instead, what you have is this kind of hodgepodge of overlapping legal systems. Now, at the top of this pyramid of kind of legal systems, you have the royal court, right? The king's court, which originally was literally the king's court. The king was the judge. The people that were combatants would come before him. People that were arguing with each other would come before him. Have you ever seen the show Last Kingdom on Netflix? There's a very good depiction of this. Right? King Alfred is literally just sitting there. And they come in, they say, well, this is what happened. And the guy who's kind of accused of something says, well, no, this is the way you should see it. Now, the king's word in that case carries a lot of authority. But how many cases is the king himself, how many cases are they actually going to sit there and adjudicate? Not that many, right? And so especially the farther away you move from the center of power, you're in France, someplace like Paris, you're in Italy, someplace like Rome perhaps, although Italy is a hodgepodge of states, there's no real centralized power. So the further away you go from the center, the more and more the regional courts matter. Regional courts tend to be dominated by nobles. So if the court in Languedoc says something, the court in Provence, that may actually mean more to you than whatever the king's court decided. At the lowest level, we have basically seigneurial courts. We have the nobles' courts over their own land. Nobles had basically the ability to make their own laws over their own domains. And so they get to create their own courts, and those courts decide whatever the noble wants. Who gets to decide what happens on a noble's land? Well, in many cases, it's the noble's word, the noble's law that matters most. Now, there were other areas where the modern state is fairly active that in the early modern period, the early modern state was not involved at all. One of the biggest of these areas is what we might call moral crimes. Moral crimes are things like adultery, heresy, sodomy, witchcraft. Right? Those are not crimes against the state, not crimes against the king. Those are crimes against God, is what they would have argued. And so who is going to carry out that trial? Not the state, but the church. So you had these ecclesiastical courts. When Joan of Arc is captured, the Burgundians basically give him over not to the English directly, but to the church who tries Joan for cross-dressing, in essence. It's the church that condemns her and executes her, which is kind of ironic because later on they end up making her a saint, right? But the state itself is not really technically involved in that decision. We're talking about financial crimes, right? We live in a world where there are all kinds of financial crimes that take place, people defrauding each other, people basically lying in the Middle Ages, using false weights. The state does not regulate the economy. Instead, you have these things called guilds, and the guilds regulate the economy. The guilds punish members who are found to be breaking the law. They find people that are practicing without a license and enforce their own laws. And so you get these kind of legal complications, these legal overlaps that make it hard for the state to project power. In the French town of Amiens, for example, there are 13 different courts. 13 different courts with some degree of jurisdiction over something. What's also kind of fascinating here is what the state is not involved in, which there is no court for. I mentioned adultery just a second ago. Did you know that in most European countries, there is no official law addressing the issue of marriage before the mid-17th century? In England, the first attempt to regulate marriage by the state happens in 1753, called the Marriage Act of 1753. There is no law about divorce in England until 1857. Before this, assuming you're not Henry VIII and you can just name yourself the head of the church and force through a divorce, before this, if you want a divorce, you literally have to have an act of parliament. Can you imagine that? You want to get divorced, you have to have an act of parliament. And of course, the church also has to agree to it. Medicine is an area where there is no state regulation in England before 1815. And so to the extent that there is any regulation going on in those two areas, it's the church, it's the guild, and they are the ones that are providing oversight or fulfilling what we would call the role of the modern state. Okay, another problem that these early modern states faced was a giant gulf between the state and the population that it ruled over. In other words, most people never really encountered the state and didn't necessarily see it as a beneficial thing. Right? Think about all the ways that you interact with the state. How many things have you done today in which you've had some kind of interaction, either you affected the state or the state affected you? Did you pay taxes? Not just income taxes, but gas tax, sales tax, alcohol tax, cigarette tax? Did you go to school? Did you have to apply for anything? Were you going to do some construction and you needed a permit from the city? Were you opening a business and you needed a license? Did you vote? Did you drive on a road or a bridge that's built by the state? I know we're doing less traveling these days than we used to, but did you apply for a passport? Was there some kind of disaster and the National Guard had to come in and help? The Army Corps of Engineers? The police, the FBI. Basically, you live in a world where you interact with the state not just every day, but multiple times a day. To have a complete absence of the state would be incredibly difficult for us to process on a kind of mental level. This is very different than the early modern world. The early modern world, the state and individuals almost never interact. In fact, really the one time that most people do interact with the state is when they pay taxes. And so the default setting for most people living in the early modern period, in the medieval period is, I just don't want anything to do with the state. As long as it stays as far away from me as possible, then I'm happy. And on the flip side, rulers take that same attitude. Governments, kings, are not interested in the welfare of their people. Nobles, for the most part, don't care about their peasants. Are they paying their taxes? Are they not revolting? Then I'm totally fine with them. Then I don't care beyond that. You're living in the United States in 2020, 2021. The joke is that every week is infrastructure week, because we keep talking about infrastructure. There's no infrastructure spending in early modern Europe. There's no social welfare system. If you're talking about poor relief, that's generally handled by the church. by local communities. Kings and queens are not keeping track, for the most part, of how many people live in their countries, in their states. It's the churches that keep vital records. If you get into genealogy and you want to look back at your family, if your family's from Europe, you're going to be relying on baptismal records and death certificates to some extent. All of that is kept by the church until relatively recently. Okay, so far we've spent a lot of time talking about what early modern rulers were not interested in doing, what they didn't think about. What were they interested in, though? What was the thing that Henry VIII sat around thinking about all the time, besides potentially having a son one day? Well, the biggest answer is glory. The purpose of kingship for almost every early modern and certainly medieval king is to win glory. That's the purpose. And it's understandable why they would do this, right? People in leadership generally don't come in saying, well, I hope I'm okay. Someone gets elected president, they say, what kind of president do you want to be? Oh, I want to be a transformational president. I want to be like JFK, or I want to be like Roosevelt, or I want to be like Reagan. Right? Nobody ever comes in and says, I really hope I'm the next Millard Fillmore. Who are your favorite presidents of all time? Chester A. Arthur. Chester A. Arthur, he's my guy. That's what I want to be one day, is the next Chester A. Arthur. James Garfield. Right? All these guys from the 19th century that no one ever remembers. Nobody does that. Nobody ever says, I want to, you're going to go play in the NFL. Okay. Where do you want your career to go? I hope I'm a backup quarterback. I hope I can sit around all day and just get paid and maybe I go play garbage time a couple of times. No, you want to be Patrick Mahomes right now, or Tom Brady, or Joe Montana, or Aaron Rodgers, or Brett Favre, or somebody. You want glory. Okay, so kings want glory. How do they get the glory? Well, the first answer is the traditional answer, which is war. And this makes a lot of sense, right? How did you get to be king in the first place? Right, we showed you that, or I played that video of the Monty Python sketch with the peasants, and one of them says to King Arthur, how did you get to be king? And the real answer to that, if you go back far enough, is that you were the best warrior. You got to be king because you kicked ass, because you took names, because you conquered. And in conquering, you got booty to distribute to your followers. Now, there are some examples where it's kind of defensive. Okay, you protected your people. There's a little bit of that. But usually, the way you got to be king in the early medieval period, or even before that, was by being the best warrior. Now, after a while, it becomes hereditary, right? So how do you get to be king? Well, my dad was king. Oh, okay. But this idea that kings should be warriors is very, very important, both in the early modern and the medieval period. In fact, medieval kings are usually out there fighting battles, leading their troops, right, in a way that would be unimaginable today. Eventually, they start to realize this is a bad idea, right? If you're the English king and you're out fighting in battles on horseback and you get shot with an arrow or eventually with musket balls, you die, oops. It's a great way to wipe out a line of succession. So over the course of time, medieval kings, early modern kings, stopped fighting directly in battles themselves. George II was the last English monarch or British monarch to fight directly in a battle. He led his troops into battle in 1743 at the Battle of Dettingen. Frederick the Great also commanded armies. He wasn't out there saying, okay, I'm going to lead the charge, but he was the commander. He was the one organizing the strategy. Louis XIV liked to kind of go along with the army. He was nominally in charge, although usually he had someone that was kind of the chief strategist, the commander of the army. So he would be there. He would watch the battles from afar, but not in any personal danger. But anyways, all of this is a reflection of the idea that to win glory, a king has to be a great warrior, or wants to be seen as a great warrior or conqueror or something like that. Now, just for argument's sake, let's say that you're not into war and battle. Let's say I'm going to be a very pious king. I'm not interested in conquering my neighbors. What can I do? I kind of just gave it away, right? Pious. So there's another path, not mutually exclusive, but try to be pious. Try to bring the church up. Build monasteries, donate money for grand works of art, build enormous cathedrals. The Reformation kind of complicates this strategy, right? How do you navigate that situation? Right? Obviously, if you're someone like Philip II of Spain, leading the Counter-Reformation kind of combines the two, right? So not only are you fighting, you're going to be a glorious warrior, but you're defending the church. You're the protector of the church. So piety is another avenue, right? It's not as flashy. Most kings are not as interested in it, or would say it's kind of like priority 1B, whereas fighting is 1A. There's a third way that we can show our power and to kind of win glory, if you will. And this is basically through wealth, right? Think about power today. I said power earlier. Probably some of you thought about wealth. Right? Who's a powerful person? Well, if Littlefinger gets enough money, he can be pretty powerful. Right? If you can buy a big enough army, it doesn't matter if you're a king or not. You've still got a big army. And so one of the things that early modern kings in particular become very, very interested in is showing off that wealth. There's a couple ways that they do this, and it's not just kings this first way. It's also nobles, right? It's fashion. It's the same way we do it today. How do you show that you're fantastically wealthy? Well, you buy a $4,000 purse. I've never understood that concept, right? From a basic level, like, why do you need a $4,000 purse? Is it functionally better than a $100 purse? Than a $20 purse? Why do you need $200 sandals? You just go to Walmart. You get sandals for like $5-10. What's the difference? Is there really, hundreds of dollars of difference built into this? Sunglasses. Why buy the designer sunglasses when you can just get the cheap sunglasses from some guy selling them off the street? Well, the answer is partly that you want to show that you're the type of person that can afford a $4,000 handbag or $200 pair of shoes or $400 sunglasses. Part of spending money is to show that you can spend money. And so this concept was not unknown to people living in the early modern period. Fashion, dress were ways of displaying or claiming social status. In the early modern period, fashion begins to focus more on the idea of opulence. This is the time period when people start wearing lots of furs. You want to have a lot of beads on your clothes. Embroidered stuff is better. If you think about the material that kings and queens are usually wearing, it's velvet, it's silk, it's studded with lots of gems, right? Picture in your mind or Google Queen Elizabeth I and just look at some of the crazy outfits that she has on. They don't particularly look very comfortable. And in fact, if we're going to talk about things that don't feel comfortable, you won't be surprised to know that this is the period that sees the invention of the corset. Now think about the corset. Corset, it's not only is it not functionally helpful, it's actually like the opposite. It's harmful. People died because they couldn't breathe enough, right? Why were women always fainting, back in the old times? Because they were wearing corsets and they couldn't breathe. So why the heck would you wear a corset? Because it reshapes your body, because it's a sign that you can afford to reshape your own body. Why would you wear silk? Well, it's comfortable a little bit, yeah. But also, it's very delicate. If you see somebody wearing a silk shirt, they're not, working in construction. What do you wear when you work in construction or in mining? You wear blue jeans. You wear material that can really take the punishment. So when you're wearing those things, you're projecting a kind of social status. You're saying, I am wealthy. And so nobles became very invested in the culture of dress. If you watch that show, The Tudors, one of the things in the later episodes that they really get into is the fashion of it, is showing all the crazy hats that people are wearing. Because hats are a great way of claiming, displaying social status. Now, any old noble can build themselves up a nice, wardrobe. But if you really want to impress people, if you really want to display that power and that status, you build. And so this is another way they do it, is through the built environment. Now, of course, the number one place people think about when they say, okay, kings building fancy places is the Palace of Versailles. But I want to talk about a kind of predecessor to the Palace of Versailles for just a minute. There are some tremendously important kings that come before Louis XIV. And one in France is a guy named King Francois I. And Francois happens to live through the Italian Renaissance. He sees all the wonderful art, all the beautiful things being designed in Rome, coming out of Rome, right? All the fountains, all the things like the Vatican and such. And so he says, I want to build my own magnificent palace here in France. I want to bring some of that Renaissance culture home to France to display the power of the French monarchy. And so he begins to build this magnificent palace called Chambord, starting in 1519. And this palace combines French and Italian styles. It has over 440 rooms, 282 fireplaces, and 84 staircases. If you ever go there, it's in the Loire Valley. It's one of the crown jewels of the Chateau of the Loire. You go up to the roof, and the roof is this incredible combination of little chimneys and bell towers. I said there's over 282 fireplaces there. That's going to need a lot of chimneys on the roof. But the way that they do it is beautiful architecturally. Now, the most impressive aspect of this palace is the double spiral staircase. We haven't gone into the Renaissance yet. We'll do that in a separate podcast. But one of the really important points of Renaissance art is the notion of perspective, is the notion of lines and sight and visuality. And so at the heart of this palace of Chambord, Francois builds this double spiral staircase that never actually meets. So they go next to each other, but they never actually intersect with one another. You can imagine the kind of comical scene. Someone's going up one side, someone's going down the other side. They never see each other. Chambord also has over 800 sculpted columns. It's got a 13,000-acre park. And if all of this is not enough, this is not like the one place that Francois says, okay, I'm going to build my palace here. This is where I'm going to stay. Francois actually builds multiple palaces all across France. Places like Amboise, Blois, at the Louvre, Fontainebleau. Right? He either builds or expands these existing palaces. Now, something that wasn't as big a deal in the medieval period, or that to the extent that it was, it's linked to the notion of piety, but that becomes bigger and more important during the Renaissance, is the idea that a king or a powerful noble should be basically a supporter of the arts, a patron of the arts. It's not enough for Francis just to be seen as a conqueror, right? To win some battles down in Italy, okay, that's great. But he wants to be seen as someone who is bringing beauty to the world. He becomes a kind of very aggressive purchaser of foreign statues. As I said, he wants to support the movement of the Renaissance up into France. Brings in lots of painters, lots of sculptors. He even tracks down this old man named Leonardo da Vinci and says, hey, Leonardo, I want you to move to France and I'll set you up with your own little cottage, but it's really a manor. It's called the Croix Lucé. It's also in the Loire Valley. And he says, come up here and make beautiful things, paint beautiful things, sculpt beautiful things, mess around with inventions. I will support you in the name of winning glory for France. And so Leonardo agrees. He makes his way north to France, and he shows up, and he's got this little painting called La Joconde. And it's just this woman, and she's smiling. Of course, I'm talking about the Mona Lisa. And so that painting then eventually becomes the property of the kings of France and eventually makes its way into the Louvre. Did you ever think about why is the Louvre? Why does it have this great Italian painting? Why is it in France? It's not that they stole it, at least not in a kind of theft sort of way, right? It's because bringing the artist, bringing his art to France was seen as a way of winning glory. Okay, one final point that I want to make here about this notion of glory, because I've been talking about glory and I've mentioned the state and its role in kind of winning glory several times. But it's worth noting that for early modern people, the state is not the thing that they really want to win glory for necessarily. Their relationship to the state is that they see it as something that they own. It's not their primary loyalty. Or quite the opposite, the thing that they would say is the most important thing is their family. Not just their own immediate nuclear family, but the house that they come from, the larger group that they come from. That's the main thing that you want to be loyal to. When someone like Philip II or Charles V of Austria is thinking about their relationship with the world, their relationship with, quote unquote, their people, they're not really concerned with the people of Spain. They're concerned with the Habsburg dynasty. And so they will use the resources of the Spanish state. They will use the resources of the Netherlands, what is today Belgium, but also Holland. And they won't care about, well, is this being used for the good of the Dutch people or is this being used for the good of the Spanish people? They said, no, needs to be used for the good of the dynasty. And so that's really another huge difference here. We talked about this gap between ordinary people and the state in the sense that they both kind of wanted it that way. For rulers as well, there is a gap in terms of the way they think about their responsibilities. That their responsibilities are directed towards the family. The state only is a means to that end. Okay, two final things I just want to briefly note. Right, I said, okay, what do early modern kings, what are they sitting around thinking about all the time? And I said the answer was that they were thinking of glory. There are two other things in addition to glory that they're interested in, although again, those are kind of a means to an end. The first of those is justice. Right, that idea of Arthur, that he's going around and trying to, secure the realm and enforce God's justice. That is true. Like, that is something that other medieval and early modern kings would have associated themselves with. Right, even if they can't necessarily project power, they still want to. They still want to claim that they're, why are you king? Well, kind of, because God needed someone here to provide order. However, justice also pays really well, and that's another reason that when the Roman state breaks down at the very beginning of the medieval period, one of the reasons that they want to get involved in it is that it's a way to make money. If you have fines that are the punishment for various crimes, who gets to keep the money collected by the fine? If you jaywalk across the street and a policeman gives you a ticket, or if you're caught speeding, what happens to that money that you just paid for your fine? It goes to the state. And so kings, and in places where you don't have kingdoms, but you have other nobles, they want to do justice, even at the seigneurial level. They want to be in charge of justice because they get to collect the fines. The other thing that kings become tangentially involved in is tax collection. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, there is no bureaucracy. They don't have the ability to collect taxes. You certainly don't have the ability to track income like we do today. It's not, in many places, it's not a monetary economy like we have today. There's a lot of bartering that goes on. And so what you tend to get are these direct taxes, where the king will say, I am placing a tax on salt. I am creating a monopoly over salt, and every time you use salt, you buy salt, a little bit of that money will come back to the state. In the 14th century in France, this is called the gabelle, Gabelle. In the following century, they institute something called the taille, Taille, and that's the hearth tax. So every hearth that you have to pay a little bit once a year. And that becomes the primary taxes that are basically funding the French government. The other places that they're trying to do this, they basically have to take in that money by making an agreement with the nobles. Okay, where all of this leaves us is that we're seeing a world in which the central state, the king, the duke, the bishop, all of them have trouble projecting power. It's very difficult for the king of France, for the king of England, for the king of Spain, to be able to project power beyond kind of his immediate or her immediate area. So as we get into the 16th and 17th centuries, when, as we saw, there's this explosion of violence, religious violence, vocational violence, social violence, right? There's lots of violence everywhere. The state is not set up to deal with that violence. It doesn't have the ability to project power to put down all these revolts and rebellions. In fact, it actually gets caught up in civil wars in a lot of these places. And so what we're talking about here in the end is a crisis of order. Is a situation where people are saying, okay, we have all this violence, we don't like it. How do we put an end to that? How do we put a stop to that? And the answer is going to come in our next episode on absolutism. Absolutism is not the thing that existed for 1,000 years of just kings saying, I'm the king, I can do whatever I want. Absolutism is a conscious political philosophy developed in response to this crisis of order. And we'll pick up with that during our next episode. So that's our show for today. Thanks for listening, everyone. If you liked what you heard, please like, share, and subscribe to History Off the Page on the streaming service of your choice. If you really liked what you heard, please support us by signing up for a monthly subscription on Patreon. For $5 a month, you'll get access to a host of additional episodes focused on narrow topics such as Jack the Ripper, the Second Industrial Revolution, or the rise of modern sports. Or you can also hit the tip jar on Venmo. To learn more about either of these, check out our website, historyoffthepage.com. So that's all for now. Join us next time as we take history off the page.